Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, gang. All right, so let us pick up where we left off in the last video talking about the Haitian Revolution. All right, here, screen. So as always, we will start with the key terms and hard words. There we go, from current slide. All right, so key terms and hard words. So what we are going to be doing today is picking up where we left off. We're going to continue our discussion on the Haitian Revolution. We're going to talk about two men, Toussain Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. We're going to reassert some French dominance, and then we're going to talk about Haiti, whether it's liberated? Question mark. So let me get my face up here a bit more, and then start talking about Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Because the two main figures amongst the former slaves, amongst the rebels, were Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Louverture would provide the ideological underpinnings of the Haitian Revolution, while Dessalines will provide the muscle. Now, Louverture was born a slave on a sugar plantation in Saint-Domingue in the 1740s. We're not 100% sure of his exact year of birth. Some say early 1740s, some say late 1740s is good enough. He was likely a house slave or a slave that worked closely to the plantation house, as he was well educated at the time of the slave rebellion in 1791. Louverture showed a command of both the French and the Creole languages, the language spoken particularly amongst the slaves in Saint-Domingue, as well as a working knowledge of Greek and Enlightenment philosophers. Louverture was a jeune de couleur. He was freed by his master in 1777, and at the time of the slave rebellion was actually running a small coffee plantation himself with about a dozen slaves. Now, Louverture was initially a moderate. He worked as a negotiator between the leaders of the rebellion and Philip Blancheland. There we go. Philippe Blancheland. See, that's why I have his name up there. I trip over the L's. Philippe Blancheland. He was the French governor general at the time of the rebellion, starting in late 1791. So when Sonthonax comes over, he's going to take over for Philippe Blancheland. So Louverture worked as a negotiator between the leaders of the rebellion and the governor general in late 1791. Louverture engaged in essentially hostage negotiations. He attempted to trade the captured white prisoners that were being held by the slave armies and return to work for the former slaves. So the French wanted the prisoners and the former slaves to go back to the plantations in exchange for banning the use of the whip for corporal punishment, getting an extra non-working day per work, so essentially going from 6 days a week to working 5 days a week, as well as the freedom of all the leaders of the slave rebellion. So Louverture was talking with the leaders of the slave rebellion and basically said, look, this is what the French want. What do you want in return? And they said, we want you guys to stop using the whip. We want an extra day off. And we want, the freedom of everybody who led the slave rebellion. Give it to us and we're fine. Louverture comes on back, goes, Philippe, mon ami, I came to a satisfactory conclusion. Here's the deal that the leaders of the slave army wants, and the French basically said, "Go, no, sacre bleu, no." The French refused the offer, And when Louverture comes back with a counteroffer, he actually had to intervene to prevent the slave leaders from ordering the execution of the white prisoners. Basically, they said, no, this is what we're doing. And if he doesn't want to do it, we're going to kill these guys. Louverture goes, no, 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 don't do that. That'll piss off the French. And yeah, you'll lose any leverage that you have on them right now. And so Louverture continued working with the leaders of the slave rebellion. And by the time of the introduction of the Spanish in 1793, as well as the British, Louverture had worked his way up in the slave rebellion to become one of its leaders and one of the conduits between the Spanish and the slaves. And it's going to be during this period that Louverture's view on slavery is going to begin to radicalize. He's going to shift from being a moderate to being someone who he's going to shift from being a moderate and someone who believed in a negotiated settlement to a position where he believed in the abolition of slavery and the creation of an independent republic. Between September 1793 and March 1794, Louverture will negotiate with Sonthonax. It's going to be primarily Sonthonax and Louverture who are going to negotiate the shifting of slave armies from the British, from supporting the British and Spanish to supporting the French again. And so Louverture will negotiate with Sonthonax regarding the shift of these slave military forces from supporting Spain and Britain to supporting revolutionary France. And so by March 1794, Louverture brings a majority of his army, approximately 4,000 men, over to the French. And for the rest of 1794 into 1795, Louverture finds himself fighting against the British. The British attempted to actually land troops in Saint-Domingue. He finds himself fighting the Spanish, who, if you remember, had invaded from Hispaniola, but actually would stop fighting the French in 1795 when we had that whole peace treaty between Spain and France, where France becomes the puppet master, as well as fighting several thousand former slaves who continued fighting against French. By 1795, Louverture and the French had repelled the British. The Spanish surrendered, and the rest of the former slaves either joined up with Louverture or had left the island completely, which meant by July 1795, the fighting had, for all intents and purposes, ended in Saint-Domingue, and the rebuilding could begin. Now, starting in July 1795, Louverture understood he needed to work with Sonthonax. And so Louverture, working with Sonthonax, working with the Frenchmen, began working to rebuild the island politically and economically. Now, Louverture understood. He understood that the basis for the long-term political health of Haiti, for the long-term political health and well-being of Haiti, the long-term political health of its people, required the colony to have a sound economic basis. And so Louverture, between throughout 1795 and 1796, Louverture pushed for reestablishing the agricultural economy in Haiti. He pushed for reestablishing the plantation system in Saint-Domingue, albeit this time organized around wage labor. You get paid a wage for the labor you do, rather than slavery. Louverture also worked at getting the émigrés, those who had left the island for Louisiana, for Cuba, for Philadelphia. He worked to those who left the island in the early stages of the slave rebellion to return back to the island, to come home, as he said. For Louverture, these men and women had skills, abilities, and more importantly, money to help rebuild the island. So Louverture was trying to get these people who had left the island to come back to help rebuild the island together. And by 1797, Louverture had established his political control over the island. Louverture managed to be appointed the top. Let me start that over. Louverture had managed to get himself appointed the top-ranking military officer on the island by 1797, and in the elections of that year, got himself elected lieutenant governor. Now you might be going, well, Mark, why didn't Louverture just get himself elected governor? Well, think about it for a second. You're trying to rebuild the island. You're trying to convince people to come back. You're trying to convince former slaves to go back to the plantation and work in exchange for money. That puts a big target on your back. So rather than putting yourself front and center, he put himself someone who's more easily controlled, who could take the heat should anything go wrong. And so the governor was essentially controlled like a puppet by Louverture. Louverture had all the ideas, and basically the governor said, "Yes, sir, I will tell your ideas. I will pass your ideas, and everybody will think it's me, but it's really you." Now, the prime rival for Louverture with respect to political power on the island was Sonthonax. And in 1797, Louverture managed to neutralize Sonthonax. No, not how you're thinking, not by killing him. The neutralize is not a euphemism for anything, but rather he managed to get Sonthonax elected. Sonthonax was elected as one of Saint-Domingue's representatives in the Legislative Assembly in France. So the Legislative Assembly had, unlike Parliament in England, had positions for colonial representation. And so Louverture got Sonthonax elected to one of those positions. And so Sonthonax left the island to go to France to be the representative or one of the representatives for Saint-Domingue. In essence, Sonthonax was exiled from the island through the electoral process. While Sonthonax still had some power, it was severely curtailed compared to the power he used to have. And Sonthonax would spend the rest of his life in France. The next year, in 1798, Louverture enters into treaties with Great Britain as well as the United States. 31 August 1798. Saint-Domingue, through Louverture, enters into a secret treaty with Britain. Now, what did the treaty say? Well, it ensured the evacuation of British prisoners, as well as Britain lifting the blockade from Saint-Domingue. I mean, it's hard to rebuild an economy when an enemy power still has you sealed off. So he manages to convince Britain to lift the blockade, to evacuate any British prisoners, in exchange for a simple promise. Britain had Louverture and others promise not to export, not to send out the idea of the idea of a slave rebellion to any nearby colonies that maybe be any nearby colonies that just might be important to, say, Britain. Oh, look, like Jamaica. So basically, Britain said, look, we'll take whatever prisoners you have, we'll take them away, we'll lift the blockade. All you have to do is just promise not to export any slave rebellion over to Jamaica. And Louverture went, hey, that's a great deal for me. That sounds like a plan. By October 1798, now that the blockade is over, Louverture and Saint-Domingue can start trading with others again. And so in October 1798, Saint-Domingue enters into a trading relationship with the United States. And this is important because at this point in history, first of all, the United States isn't as powerful as today. But at this point in history, the United States and France are in an undeclared naval war. And the United States had suspended all trade with France, which meant that Haiti could not sell its sugar to the United States. And both the United States and Saint-Domingue, Louverture in particular, wanted to continue good trade relationships. Good trade relations. Louverture is thinking, I need to rebuild this economy. I get a good, solid economy. I have something to build a good, solid, long-term political state on. And the president at the time, President John Adams, pushed Louverture to declare independence. But Louverture is going, no. I still believe in France. I'm still very much in France's camp. So long as France continues the abolition of slavery, I will support my fellow Frenchmen. And Adams goes, okay, I mean, I can't change your mind. We'll just continue trading with one another. 1799, 1800, Saint-Domingue found itself in the midst of civil war as Alexander Rigaud, one too many, there we go, Alexander Rigaud attempted to seize power from Louverture. Because Rigaud believed that Louverture is in the process of reinstating the racial hierarchy that was in Saint-Domingue prior to the slave rebellion. And Rigaud's going, no, Louverture is going too far. He's bringing people back to the plantation, and you know what back to the plantation means. While Louverture believed that Rigaud is simply trying to take control of the island for himself. He wants the island for himself. Louverture and his army ends up defeating Rigaud and has him exiled to France. Now, the other man, I'm just going to briefly mention Dessalines right now before we pick him up in a little bit. Jean-Jacques Dessalines was Louverture's most trusted lieutenant during this period. In fact, it was Dessalines that was placed in command of the military forces that defeated and exiled Rigaud. Now, unlike Louverture, Dessalines was a slave who worked on a he was a slave who worked on a sugar plantation at the time of the slave rebellion. Furthermore, Dessalines had a more racially pure, shall we say, a racially pure view of the island, and became known for his violence against les gens de couleur and the free whites. Dessalines will become Louverture's successor on the island. Now, let's talk about what's happening in France and how that's reflected in Haiti. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte takes over the French government in November 1799 and starts turning his eyes to reasserting French dominance in the New World. He's at a time of peace and he starts looking at what's happening in the New World and goes, I don't quite have enough control over that. I got to reassert French dominance. And part of the reason why Napoleon started thinking this way is because Louverture sets up a constitution for Saint-Domingue in 1801, known as the Constitution of 1801. This constitution was written by a colonial assembly that was appointed by Louverture, and it did several interesting things for the colony of Saint-Domingue. First and foremost, it made Louverture the Governor General for life, and it permitted Louverture and future Governor Generals the power to appoint his own successor. So Louverture could look around and go, Mark, you will be my next successor. And I would be the next successor. So Louverture becomes Governor General for life, no more elections for Governor General, and he has the power to appoint his own successors. The Constitution of 1801 explicitly stated that slavery would not exist on the island, and that all men were, quote, were born, live, and die free and French. So again, Louverture is very much, at least at this point in 1801, still in the French camp, still on the French side of things. It guaranteed equality and equal treatment under the law for all races, whether Grand Blanc, Petit Blanc, Jean de Couleur, former slaves, doesn't matter. And established Roman Catholicism as the established church. And again, established church means that it is a main church supported by the state. But what the Constitution of 1801 did not do is it did not declare Saint-Domingue independent from France. But it was still considered a colony. It was still considered a part of France. So again, by this point, Saint-Domingue is still part and parcel of France, very much in the French, on the French side of things. Oh, and then we get Napoleon. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte, he did not. He's on the left. On the left here, by the way. Oh, Napoleon did not exactly like the fact, that Louverture had gone and created a constitution for Saint-Domingue. He did not like the fact that Haiti set itself up its own constitution. At the same time this was going on, Napoleon was starting to feel political pressure from emigres from Saint-Domingue. People who had left Saint-Domingue early in the rebellion decided not to go back to the island, and was starting to put pressure on Napoleon to bring the island back under control. Nationalists at the same time are going, this is our country, this is our land, this is not Louverture's land. We got to bring it back under direct French control and have it start contributing to the French economy again. In addition, at this point, France had settled into a short period of peace with Britain, and Napoleon wanted to restart the French New World Empire with Louisiana and Saint-Domingue at the center. Saint-Domingue, Haiti would provide the money. Louisiana would provide the land and territory for France to really reestablish its New World Empire. And so in December 1801, Napoleon orders a French fleet of about 30,000 men to retake the island of Hispaniola. By 1801, Louverture had actually conquered the entirety of the island from the Spanish, so it was the entirety of the island was under Louverture's control. And so between February and April 1802, the French military retook control of Saint-Domingue. Within 6 months, well, really within a month, within six time, am I right? Within 6 months of the French arriving and within 1 month of French military dominance, Louverture began to go in and negotiate with the general in charge, General Leclerc. And on 6 May 1802, Louverture went in to talk with General Leclerc about treatment of captured Haitians when he himself was taken by the French. Louverture was exiled off the island in June and taken back to France in chains. Once there, he was imprisoned until his death. He was not executed by the French. He died in prison on 7 April 1803. Now, shortly after Louverture's capture, the island begins taking its revenge out on the French. Yellow fever began ravaging through the French soldiers and citizens. General Leclerc himself dies from yellow fever on 1 November 1802. If you read in the book, you could remember his wife's response to his death, as well as his wife's response to actually being on the island. On the island, it's like, hey, I don't really care about my husband. I am. In fact, Leclerc was Napoleon's brother-in-law. Mrs. Leclerc was Napoleon's sister. So on the island, it's like, yeah, I don't really care about my husband. He can go do his own thing. I'm just married just to be married. I'm just married so I could have status in society. My husband gives me status. He's not going to go anywhere because of my brother. Therefore, I can do what I want. Then when General Leclerc dies of yellow fever, Mrs. Leclerc rends her garments. She's weeping. She's distraught, not only because her husband had died, but with the death of her husband, she loses her status in society. Yellow fever will kill up to 2/3 of all the French soldiers who arrived in Saint-Domingue. So a disease will kill between 18 to 20,000 soldiers. Jean-Jacques Dessalines will once again take up the mantle of rebellion and start fighting against the French. By December 1803, most of the remaining French had fled the island, trying to run the British blockade. That's what that's what her sister both tried doing. That's why she's taken to Jamaica. And on the 1st of January 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines declares the first Black Republic of Haiti on the 1st of January 1804. Haiti will become the second independent nation in the Americas after the United States, and the first nation created by a successful slave rebellion. Dessalines would order the slaughter of the remaining French on the island, as described in Hassel's book, between February and April 1804. This is a contemporaneous etching, contemporaneous drawing of the riot in the Plain of the Cap, so just outside of Cape Francois, the massacre of whites by the blacks. And here we see them using the butts of rifles, axes, knives, machetes, anything they could get their hands on. And 2,000 whites would be murdered in Cape Francois, an additional 900 in Port-au-Prince, and 400 more in Jérémie. all told, anywhere between 3 to 5,000 white men, women, and children were killed by Dessalines and his men in those 3 months. Now, let's talk about Haiti liberated? Question mark. Because upon proclaiming independence, Dessalines sets up a new constitution of 1804. Now, the Constitution of 1804 called for a number of social freedoms, including the complete freedom of religion. So the Roman Catholic Church is no longer the main church. It's still around, but people could worship however they choose. And for Dessalines and others on the island, what we have is, prior to all this, is the creation of a Afro-Christianity, a sort of Christianized religion that takes aspects of local culture as well as aspects of culture coming over from Africa with the slaves. With the Roman Catholic Church, that was kind of pushed to the side. It was kind of, that's not the right religion. Now it's Constitution of 1804. People can engage in Afro-Christianity. People can engage in Protestantism. They can engage in local religions such as voodoo. Hoodoo, the voodoo that you do so well. So complete freedom of religion. All citizens, regardless of their skin color, would be referred to as black in an attempt to avoid the reestablishment of racial hierarchy. And this is somewhat similar to what France did a decade earlier, where to avoid reestablishing a class hierarchy, everybody from the king, while he was still alive, down to the lowest person, was referred to as citizen. So trying to avoid the reestablishment of class hierarchy, in this case, to avoid the reestablishment of racial hierarchy, all citizens are referred to as black. And as a result, white men were prohibited from holding property. What this did was it essentially set up a tried to set up a system where outside funding couldn't come in because these were white men. They were not citizens of Haiti. If you were already on the island, which you likely were not, if you were white, you probably GTFO'd. Then you were prohibited from holding property. Now, that causes a couple of problems because by the end of 1804, Dessalines says, no, I'm not quite happy with this republic. I know Haiti is now the first Haitian empire. And I'm going to set myself up as Emperor Jacques I. Dessalines sets himself up as emperor for life with the power to name his own successor. And so Emperor Jacques I, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, worked to get the sugar and coffee plantations back up and running and producing them. Again, you need money for a stable political environment. And so Dessalines started issuing orders, including that all blacks, that is all citizens now, would either have to work as soldiers to protect the nation or as labor on the plantation to help produce sugar and coffee for export. Now, Dessalines got into a little bit of trouble when he started putting literate, fair-skinned, lighter-skinned blacks in positions of power in his administration. And that alienated some of his supporters because some of his supporters are going, Emperor Jacques, you said we're not going to have a racial hierarchy, but now you have lighter skinned people above darker skinned people. WTF? And so almost 2 years into his reign, Emperor Jacques I was assassinated on 17 October 1806, leading to the end of the First Haitian Empire. For the next 200 plus years, Haiti will then vacillate. Haiti will go back and forth between being ruled by strongmen, such as the Duvaliers in the 60s and 70s, or periods of instability. All right, so I'm going to end our look for now at Haiti here. We're going to pick up with Haiti when we start talking more about the United States and their dealings with the Caribbean. So do not forget, the Hassel book is due in on the 1st. So that is 1 week from this Thursday, which means your research paper is due in 3 weeks from this Thursday. So hopefully you guys are working hard and getting everything done. All right, so I'm going to let you guys go here. Go forth, slay dragons, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, bye.